Good morning, Year 10. Here we are today for Poetry Shop Session 2, and today we're going to be looking at London by William Blake. So again, I'm going to start by reading the poem and then give you a few of those super top tips that you're going to need to make sure that you really get inside this text, just to keep those plates spinning for you. So let's start with the poem. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So quite a depressing and miserable sounding poem for you there. So let's just start off with the title, because as I've mentioned and will continue to do, every single title, or most of them at least, have relevance to you. So the word London, why is that significant, you might think? Well, for this poem, it's hugely so, because when we think about it, the capital of this nation is also the seat of great power, because it's the home of the institutions of state, the monarchy, the government, the military, that really do control our lives, or at least have the power to do it. And so there is a sense that by using this setting, Blake is able to make a huge political comment on the society in which he lived. Okay, so a little bit of context here. Blake was what we would call the grandpa, if you like, of the Romantic movement, a very early Romantic poet, very much like Shelley, who we looked at last time in our shop for Ozymandias. And as the Romantics had this real fanciful and idealised view of nature, they did find city life really, really negative. They didn't feel that it allowed for creativity and individuality. It was, after all, nature that had the power to heal, because it gave man the freedom to roam and to immerse himself in the beauty of it. There is also a sense that these early Romantics were real revolutionaries, and William Blake would have been influenced by events elsewhere in Europe, because at this time the French Revolution had just kicked off and it went across France in its bloody path. And Blake felt that revolution was something that could really, really happen here. So there are aspects of this poem that really do allude to the French Revolution. And this poem really does suggest that the experience of living in this capital city could actually encourage a revolution on the streets of London itself. So all of those things are worth a little thought. There's lots and lots of things to consider here. Now, just to reiterate what the poem is about, this poem has got loads of beautiful stuff we can talk about in just a moment for AO2. But I'm just going to give you a sense, just to sort of sum up what you think this is going to be about. So what this poem is doing is it's simply describing an individual's journey through the streets of London, and it offers the reader a glimpse of what the speaker sees. Now, sadly, this is not a lovely, exciting, neon lit city that we might, really pull our imaginations towards today, because this speaker sees the city as terrible. The conditions are so desperate, and they are faced by the majority of the inhabitants of this place. He sees child labour. We see in the poem restrictive laws of property, and also prostitution and immorality also come through. We've got a criticism of laws, and we've got a criticism of the institutions of state, which I've already mentioned. There is a real sense too that we have got this unfair ownership in the city, and I'll talk about that in just a minute when we start to do some language analysis. So we see that pretty much from this poem, every aspect of life in London is owned and controlled. It's really dreadful. Blake also, contextually speaking too, was very much an objector to organised religion. He really didn't like it, and you can see within this poem too, he will criticise it quite heavily, which at the time was quite a dangerous thing to do. He was actually arrested for criticising the military and the aristocracy and various other things too. So he was quite radical in his own little way. So this poem ends with this horrible vision of the terrible consequences to be faced by a city that seems to have lost its moral compass. And we also see this rife and terrible consequence of sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, which was absolutely everywhere in London at this time. Now, the speaker in this poem, like Blake, has got a really negative view of the city. The conditions faced by people there seem to cause them as individuals to decay in all senses. That's physically, morally, and spiritually as well. And we can actually see here quite contradictory, I can't speak this morning, in quite a contradictory way, that the tone becomes quite biblical, and it reflects Blake's strong sort of criticism that he has. It's almost ironic that he uses that. The poem itself is pessimistic, and it almost seems without hope for the future, suggesting that without change, that this is going to be the legacy that we as human individuals experience in this place. Okay, so let's start with a bit of AO2, my favourite bit. Okay then, so I'm going to start with looking in stanza 1 at the word chartered. Now the word chartered is repeated here, so a nice bit of repetition in stanza 1. And the word chartered in this concept or in this context relates to ideas of ownership or a decree that's made by those in power. Now, what we see as being owned by a charter are the streets and the river. So this suggests that man does not have the freedom of these, and also it's this sense that man is trying to control this beast of a river. Man is trying to contain it. So it's almost interfering with nature. And so we can see this sort of sense of a lack of freedom that emerges. We don't have the freedom to roam in this place. We've also got repetition that comes through again of the word marks, and this is very important. This could, of course, refer to physical marks that the speakers demonstrate. Is it the sadness that appears on their faces? It could certainly be that. Could the marks be the speaker himself checking or noting or marking as a checklist almost what he sees as he walks the streets of London? Additionally, we can think contextually again just with that word marks, because this could of course link to slavery, which was still very much in evidence at this time. Remember, a mark or a brand is what used to designate ownership of individuals to slave owners. Now, I also want to think about this idea in stanza 2. We have got every man and every infant and every voice. This is suggestive that this sadness starts from the cradle and goes through to the grave. It's this really intense sense of misery that is like this inescapable loop for the inhabitants of this place. But it's in stanza 2 that we see the most incredible metaphor of the poem, and I really love this. It's the mind-forged manacles. Now, my lovelies, just to remind you, manacles are like sets of handcuffs. They are the iron containment devices that slaves would wear around their wrists and ankles to prevent them from leaving. So again, could be context. Yeah, you're right if you're thinking that. But at the same time, this idea of them being mind forged, which, you know, a forge is a place where metal work is dealt with and manacles or shackles would be made. But because this happens in the mind, guys, it's simply this idea that people are conditioned to believe in their own imprisonment and they can't actually escape from it. So it's pretty scary, to be perfectly honest with you. It's almost like the city has robbed them of the ability to think for themselves. It controls everything. So it's kind of like a modern day Big Brother. If we were looking at it from that modern day perspective, it's everywhere and controlling what we think. Another thing to say is that this poem is absolutely full of negative lexis, or if you want to just put it simply, words. All right, there's a pattern of words here that comes through. So let's pick out a few of these bad boys and see what we think. We've got weakness, woe, cry, fear, appalls, blood, blight, plagues, hearse. So the language of misery and death is all the way through it. It runs like a thread throughout. So it's quite unpleasant, isn't it? It's not going to win any prizes for an uplifting piece of work. Now, what we see as we go into stanza 3 is we have got this idea of a blackening church. Loving this, guys. Now, this could mean two things. It could firstly relate to the ideas of the early rumblings of the Industrial Revolution, so the church and the buildings being polluted by the soot that's coming out of chimneys. Or it could certainly be blackening on a more metaphorical level. So something like it's a dark heart, it's becoming corrupt from the inside, it's failing to help those innocent people like the chimney sweepers who need the assistance and the nurture of the church, as one would expect. There's also this sense of the hapless soldier. This is a criticism of the military. We can see it's almost like how the powers that be can send these people to their deaths and they have no choice. And the soldier becomes disillusioned by the idea of having to fight for his country. And we've got this idea of how the soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Again, really political. And this was one of the things that Blake got into trouble for, because he's basically saying there, isn't he, that the blood that is shed by the soldiers is on the hands of the people that sent him there, which are those in government and monarchy. So as we go through to the last stanza in terms of language aspects that we can look at, we've got this ending and we have got this idea of a marriage hearse. Oh my word, this is an interesting sort of oxymoron, isn't it? Marriage represents the beginning and a hearse represents ending, so death. So we've got a little bit of an oxymoron going on. So to Blake, we've got this idea that marriage should be a celebration of love, and with it, the beginning of new life. It's very different back then, guys. People didn't have to get, well, they had to get married to have children, really, in a respectful sense. But what we've got here is this idea of marriage being combined with the word hearse. As we all know, this is a vehicle that's associated with funerals. And when we think about it, we see Blake showing us that a future brings nothing but death and decay. Perhaps it's through the immorality of men, certainly at that time. All society were immoral, so I'm not being sexist there at all. But men had a lot more freedoms in the city. And we can actually see that perhaps by having a very immoral approach to life before marriage, they were bringing syphilis or sexually transmitted disease into the relationship. And therefore, the legacy of inheritance that they were passing to their babies was not one that was very good. Okay, so there's lots of things there to think about. I'm going to very briskly rip through structure because this is very important. And remember again, you don't need to talk about structure unless you're in sets 1 or 2 and probably in set 3, but this stuff is usually very, very favourably looked on by examiners. So let's just have a quick look at it here. Now, this structure is really tightly controlled and contained. And this also is a parallel to what life in London was like. So what we can actually see here is Blake uses what we call an alternating or an A-B rhyme scheme. So we have got street, meet, flow, woe. Every other line rhymes, okay? Now this is very regular, it's very repetitive, it's very dull, okay? We also see the poems arranged in stanzas of 4 lines, which are almost like little chapters. These 4-line stanzas are called quatrains. And if you imagine, it's like a photograph album. Each little quatrain gives us a particular picture of the streets of London as the speaker traverses its path. The next thing to say, guys, is the poem has what we call a very specific meter. And here it is iambic tetrameter, and this is 4 stressed and 4 unstressed syllables. So it goes, I wander through each chartered street. Okay, now this gives a real plodding sense of somebody who is doing something very dull, almost like they're on a treadmill. Okay. So my lovely people, that is going to conclude today's poetry shot. I hope that it's all starting to come back to you. I'm sorry I can't be more positive about the view of London that William Blake had, but it's a really good one to talk about. It's nice and simple, and it also compares with lots of poems. So what I'm going to do is to ask you for the next couple of minutes just to think about which texts you might find yourself able to compare this one with. Okay, my lovelies, do take care, and I will speak to you next week when we look at our next text in the anthology. See you soon and take care of yourselves. Bye now.